Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, March 28th edition of the Cluster API Working Group, a working group of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have a few agenda items today, and it looks like folks are just now signing into the doc. The first agenda item we have is from Robert, who is out for the next following weeks. So it says he won't be responding via email or Slack, won't be reachable. So if anybody needs him or anything else, contact us or the rest of the SIG and we can probably help you out. The next item we have a pull request is updating API server and API machinery libraries to 1.9. Need to pick up fixes to properly generate machine deployment.
Right now this PR only updates to 1.9. It does not have a fix. There's a dependency on the API server builder to actually have that fix. I can probably link the PR from the API server builder repo as well. There's a problem in how they generate strategies for merging, which doesn't seem to work. So this PR needs to be in before we can we'll need to do another update to get the API server builder. But for now, this only updates all the machinery to 1.9.
Okay.
So, and yeah, that's pretty much it for this, unless anyone has any concerns about this.
No, that looks good to me. I ran into this as well when I was vendoring the API server code last week, where I wanted to upgrade my API machinery to 1.9 as well. So this works great for me.
Okay, cool. The other thing is the machine deployments PR is out for discussion or in comments. It only introduces the types because I cannot generate the code because the API server builder doesn't work. So we're waiting on that.
Okay. Are you going to generate the code before we merge the PR? Or are you going to do that in a separate PR?
I will do it before we merge it, but I would like to get comments now.
Okay.
On the type definitions.
Is that the 232 here, API server builder PR?
No, not that one. Yes, that's the one that's required for the second merge.
Okay, cool.
658 is what is the machine deployments PR.
Okay. Cool. So I'll take a look at the machine deployments PR. Anything else on your two items?
No, that's about it.
Okay. Chris, you have something on the machine class prototype?
Friday before Robbie went out for a while, he posted a machine class prototype, and I just wanted to point it out. It's there for view. I've already provided some feedback on it, particularly with how we specify available capacity versus actual capacity, and how that might actually feed back to changes in the machine spec instead of the machine class. But I would like to get more eyes on it, and I will try to ping to the autoscaler team to make sure that the things we discuss satisfy what they need.
Okay.
So a little feedback on me on that. So right now, from what I've seen, that Robert added the capacity there, what is also called the capacity, the parameters, and all those kinds of things, which is great. Especially if you want to provide like a generic way to specify CPU and all those resources. My question is, should it be better to put those parameters, the capacities, and all those different things into the cloud config configuration or whatever it was called into the parent object, and only reference the cloud config, the provider config role extension as a reference, or was the point? I mean, so from the looks of things, with the current APIs that Robert is proposing, you are only able to change to reference the cloud config. And yeah, my question was about this. So are we going to have only the cloud config as the role extension as as a referenceable, or the entire class can be inlined?
I'm not sure I 100% follow. Let me see if I can look at it real quick. So you're talking about how he changed the machine types to have a machine class reference?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, originally, more or less, the idea was to have the configuration, the provider config, either to be inlined or to be a reference. Yes.
Yes.
And after the change to machine class, I'm wondering if it's not better just to have the machine class also to have the possibility for the entire machine class to be inlined, not only the provider config.
Oh, I see. So, yeah, the machine type has a provider config struct where you can inline the provider config, or you can get a value from a provider config source. But the provider config source is actually a machine class ref, not a provider ref. So it gets more information in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my idea was to have either a reference or inlining.
I see. I think that's good feedback. If you could put that on the PR itself, we could discuss it in long form.
Yeah, okay.
Again, this is Robert's proposal, but I'm kind of shepherding it for at least the few weeks he's out.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to add that as an action item to follow up on the PR. Okay, anything else on Robert's PR? I think the one thing that I would want to just call out about it is if we are trying to push to a stable release of the API, whatever that means, this would sort of be implicitly needed to be solved before we get to that stable release. So I'm going to flag that as well, and we can talk more about what we're going to do with this as we talk about migrating to a new repository, which is conveniently coming up. I guess my next thing is in the new repository, I updated the owners file and used my almighty Git privileges to just merge that in. So hopefully other people can start to review PRs as well, and we can start to work. Has anybody had a chance to look at that or test to see if they have a merge button and the bots are working as expected?
I don't think the owners file affects the merge button. It affects how you can interact with the bot, but it doesn't enable GitHub UI features.
Right, but shouldn't we be able to kick off merges from the bot now that we are in the owners file? I'm still new to the whole owners file paradigms.
There's some test infra. We need to check some things in to enable the bot for certain things in the test infra repo, and I'm not sure that the auto merge or registering it in a tied pool has been done yet. But before we even get to that, I'd want to get the unit test over there and the CI testing so that we have tests before we merge.
Okay. So when you say unit test and CI testing, you mean just get the test infrastructure in place so that all pull requests go through some CI/CD before they get merged?
Yeah, and that probably requires us migrating the code over to have the test run, because the entry point for the CI test is actually scripts that live in the kube deploy repo.
Okay.
And you can just assign those to me if you want me to take care of it. I might be delayed getting to it this week, but I should be able to pick it up at some point in the next week.
Okay.
If someone else doesn't want to beat me to it.
Okay. I will. I'll create some issues there, and I'll CC you and myself, and same thing. If I get some time, I'll see if I can't look at it. If not.
Yeah, and just as a side note, we kind of reached out to the Kubernetes SIG org leaders to get some more people to be admin of that repo, like in GitHub. So It's not just you that has write access to it now. It's Rodrigo, Robbie, and myself as well.
Oh, good.
Just as escape hatches.
Yes. Okay, cool. The one thing that I've been kind of thinking about, I watched the call from last week. This is relevant to the migration, like the bigger migration effort in general, was one of the issues I brought up, and again, I'm sorry I missed the call, was what do we want to migrate and what do we not want to migrate? And it looks like just moving the API definition in the common code is going to be a little more tricky than we thought. So one of the things that I was kind of motoring on was, what if we did an exact one-to-one from the cluster API directory into the new repo? And then we can follow up on pulling things out through some number of other pull requests after the fact. I didn't know how that resonated with anyone else though.
So you're talking about just copying everything over and then working on pull requests to remove things?
Exactly. Like just do a one-to-one just to get us migrated to the repo, and that way it's less of a exercise of figuring out what needs to be moved and more of an exercise of just move all the things. And then once we're there, then we can look at pulling things out as needed.
Yeah, I think before we move, even attempt that, we need to figure out some things too. Like right now we use the k8s.io/kubedeploy prefix.
Mm-hmm.
We need to figure out what prefix we're going to move to, whether we just do a github.com one, or if we can do some other k8s.io redirect. So we need to decide on that before we move all the code, because it has to have an appropriate path name. Yeah, I think that's one of the major logistic hurdles. I can't think of any more.
Yeah.
I know I had a couple more, but I can't remember them right now.
Yeah, I think it's figuring out imports, which this is relevant to, and then issues. And then, like, ideally, we're not in a situation where we have 2 copies of code in the same place for too terribly long. So maybe we can, like, get a proposal, get everybody comfortable with it, and then pick an afternoon to actually go and do the dirty work or something.
Yeah, is there a proposal or an issue discussing this right now that we could like add these items to, and maybe like in the top level of the issue have a checklist of things that need to be done, and we can track the items there?
Yeah, there is I sent a proposal out. I can update it with what we just talked about, and then get a checklist in there. And as long as that looks good to everyone else, we can start to go through the checklist.
Yeah, can we just link that proposal in the meeting notes right now so we can all look at this and go to it?
Yep, 1 second.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I think the big difference between what I was just proposing and what's actually written here, again, is just in the proposal, it's more of a, we should only migrate these subset of features. And what I'm saying is it might be easier just to migrate everything, which I don't really have strong opinions either way. It just seems like an easier avenue. Okay. Any other thoughts here?
Just one thing from my side. During the cluster lifecycle meeting, Brian Grant, for those of you who were not present, explained more or less the new subprojects and all those kinds of SIG-owned code. So what we're going to do about it, I mean, right now the kube deploy is listed as a subproject. into the SIG cluster lifecycle, and are you going to have a sub-project of our own, or some ideas on the follow-up?
I think based on what Brian said in SIG Cluster Lifecycle yesterday, we are a sub-project and not a working group, so there's probably a bit of verbiage that needs to be updated there. And then I think as a sub-project, we have there's certain expectations of us as far as like defining our charter and our scope of work and things like that. I think this might be like, I don't know, it's either we go out of our way and do the items needed ourselves as a sub-project, or we wait for that mandate to come down from SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Personally, I'm a fan of the less work option, but I don't know what everybody else thinks.
I have to go and watch yesterday's meeting. Apparently, I was unable to attend to know what this is.
Okay. Yeah, there's a handful of action items that both SIG Cluster Lifecycle and all corresponding working groups kind of have as a homework assignment without really a strict due date. So whenever we get those done. Okay. Maybe we bring.
Make one comment on that. It seems like right now with most of this working group support going into kube deploy repo, it's harder for people to discover that repo. It's kind of it's a little bit like, you know, it's a little bit of an odd place, it seems. So if there was I guess what I'm thinking is that sub project is important from the perspective of contribution and discoverability, right? Like discoverability is, sorry, from the perspective of sub-project discovery for users and potential contributors.
Totally agree. I mean, I think it's important that we kind of go through the rebranding of going from a working group to a sub-project. I think it's just a matter of figuring out how and when. I think a good natural path out of here would be to have somebody act as a representative on behalf of our sub-project and bring this up in the next SIG Cluster Lifecycle meeting and just ask what we think we should do. Justin says vote Nova. I tend to agree. Okay, we got 2 thumbs up. Okay, I'll bring this up next Tuesday. I'll add it to the SIG Cluster Lifecycle agenda right now if you guys want to give me a second to pull that up. Okay, and I'm gonna have to create a new one, so bear with me.
I almost feel that like I feel like there won't be any real pushback on being a sub-project. I think the interesting question is where we want our repo to live. And I think there may be a good case for being Kubernetes/machines, but maybe that we haven't justified it yet.
Like creating a new repo or using or renaming the cluster API repo?
Either. I don't think there's a huge difference between which cluster API repo.
So we have a new one, github.com/Kubernetes SIG/cluster-API.
Yeah, so I think there may be a case based on what Brian said yesterday. I feel like there might be a case for this actually being one of the repos that is not even under Kubernetes-SIGs in the long term. And I don't know if we want that, but I can see that like in 3 or 6 months that we could easily justify being in Kubernetes/machines API. Like a top level thing, but I don't know whether we could do that yet. And I think the reason I bring it up now is because if we agree that is something we want to do, like whether that informs our immediate paths, or whether we stick to what we've got for now and prove that we are worthy of a top level thing.
I think it would be cool to be in the top level personally, because I really feel like the infrastructure layers are super important to Kubernetes and often get what's the word I'm trying to say here? Overlooked. I I mean, I don't know. Should we open up a proposal for that, or what are our thoughts here? Like, I don't know how hard of an uphill battle this would be to potentially get, Kubernetes / machine cluster API, machines API, whatever.
I personally think it might be a little premature, but that's just me. I don't want to take on like too much movement at once. I'd rather settle on a repo we know we can get and focus on getting a really good product and then letting the product speak for itself.
I tend to agree with that philosophy.
I agree with that. I think that maybe though, if we think our repos are good but not perfect, that we don't need to fix that immediately, and because we feel that like eventually we'll get into the top level repo if we produce a great product. More.
Okay. This is going to be the most meta thing I say all day. I would propose that we write a proposal that would go into the new repository that would say why we think this should be, for lack of a better term, a core primitive. And get some reasoning in there and let some folks think about it. And if it seems like there's high level adoption and it's an easy win for us, cross that bridge when it comes. And in the meantime, continue to work and build out the cluster API in the repo we have it and continue our work in this direction. Okay, Justin, that's your homework. Ready, break.
We're using the word core, just FYI.
I just don't know what else to call it, right?
Yeah, but don't call it core. That's like
a
rail of naming.
A high top level primitive, a first class citizen. I feel like those are okay words to use.
Yeah, okay.
Let me add an action item here for you, Justin, and then I have one more thing I wanted to bring up. Okay, that is now assigned to you. The one thing I wanted to bring up is I volunteered to bring up the working group versus sub-project in next Tuesday's SIG Cluster Lifecycle meeting. I'm going to be out next week. Does anybody, I added it to the agenda. Does anybody want to volunteer to bring that up and track that work and plug it back into these calls the following week? If not, it'll just get pushed back a week, which is fine too.
I can try to attend, but I'm not sure that I'll be able to make it.
Okay, I'll keep it in the agenda. If you're there, bring it up and feel free to talk about it. If not, I'll put a sub note in to say that we can punt if needed, and I can bring it up the following week. Cool. Anything else for the cluster API stuff?
So, okay, we have got a lot of time. So I was just curious that have you already given thought about orphan machines and cases like that? So in our case, we have types defined, but we expect user to write the controller, and then we also write the controller, which might have bugs inside it, right? So there is still a possibility that machine set, let's say, ends up creating more machine than it should be. Or I would say what we have seen, the way cloud providers behaves, that sometimes it gives from the cloud provider SDK, we give a response that it has actually created the machine, but the machine is not created. In that case, machine object becomes orphan. And in other way around, if it happens and machine itself becomes orphan. So have you given thought about it, or is there any strategy on that? How we will be dealing with these orphan machines? Or just to prevent machine set or machine deployment to explode, maybe in terms of number of machines.
I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily a cluster API mandated concern, but it's definitely something that happens a lot. I've seen it in almost every Kubernetes deployment tool I've worked with, where some infrastructure can get orphaned somehow. Usually that happens like through a failed deployment or a partially deployed deployment. I've seen a lot of different tips and tricks. I know the Go team has like a scraper that will go in like every night and just destroy all infrastructure in a given account. So there's a lot of different avenues here, but I guess the higher level question for me would be if this is something that we want to prescribe.
Okay. So because in machine controller manager we recently saw this thing and we ended up writing a safety controller. So what we try to do is that in every machine object that we create, we basically put a specific label which refers to the cluster name. So it's like in all providers supports either like AWS supports tags and Google supports network tags and so on, right? So we put this kind of tags and then a separate in parallel safety controller will basically keep an eye on the machines with the same tags, and it will have a map across the actual machines and the machine objects which are created. And if it finds that the machines are orphan, it can easily delete it. But the interesting use case is in the second part, where at any point, because of the bug or some reason, if machine set tries to create more machine objects or more machines, then what safety controller does, it basically freezes the machine deployment. So if you see each either machine deployment or machine set has some kind of sync handler inside it, right? So we basically skip that loop continuously if the freeze label is there on the machine. So that logic and that I mean that is actually coming up to be really useful in our case, because OpenStack and some other providers does behave weird sometimes. I mean, we don't know when they respond what. They say we get the response that machine is created, but it's not there. And sometimes timeout occurs and so on. So I was just wondering if that approach makes sense, or there is any input from anyone else. Because in our case, if you see the types are something that is defined, but if user tries to write the controller, then the controller is the only component which is talking to cloud provider, and this can actually cost huge. This is something which can actually cost the resources because of the minor bugs, like creating a lot of VMs and so on.
Yeah, I knew it was just going to be a matter of time before we brought up tagging resources in cloud provider account. Yeah, Justin's giving us the thumbs up. It's a well-known problem, especially because a lot of the cloud providers kind of follow the it's okay to be eventually consistent mentality. So even with a tag, like you can create a tag and then there's some delta in time before like you might be able to read or render that tag. So it's a hard problem to solve. I think probably the best pattern, and this is my opinion for what it's worth, that I've seen is every time you create infrastructure, you also, it's sort of like an atomic creation where you hang until you're able to also recognize the infrastructure from the cloud as well. So that would be like a controller level primitive that would say, if you are making a mutation, you don't want to consider that mutation valid until you're also able to read from the cloud that your mutation has succeeded the way you intended it to. That is how I've kind of approached this, but again, there's sort of like pros and cons to each different way, depending on what your concerns are.
Yes, that's correct. So ideally, the controllers themselves should be mature enough to take care of this part, but it does so happen that sometimes it becomes so impossible for the controller themselves at the moment to understand, because, for example, cloud provider is timing out or is not reachable at all for some moment. So the creation call internally might have gone through, the VM is created, but then you are not able to reach the cloud provider and controller cannot do anything about it. So if any other process maybe is like running in parallel, which can later on garbage collect such resources. But what you said is correct. Then there could be a completely separate thing which can do like every day or every 24 hours, which wipes out all this stuff.
So, I mean, my 2 cents is that the machine controller should be responsible for the underlying instances and making sure that they're all bound to a machine, as it were. So if you have an extra instance that you know you're responsible for, that you created, but isn't backed by a machine, I think you should delete it. And hopefully that will just be part of the sort of normal reconcile loop. Now, how would we do that? So like on AWS, for example, we would tag every machine that we launch so that we know that that we're responsible for it and not some other machine that the user's running. And then I think I would probably, personally, I haven't done it yet, but I would probably also tag if I'm launching instances directly, I would tag each instance with the machine UUID, the UUID of the machine object, so that I'm able to reconcile in that way. And then I think it would be safe to delete any instances that are completely like orphaned. But then you can also sort of, even if you restart at just the wrong time, you can still reconcile it to a machine. If that machine still exists, you can sort of recover from most scenarios. The other case I think is you have a machine, but it's running in the infrastructure, but it doesn't join as a node. And that one I think should be generic. I don't think that one should be down to the machine controller to do. I think that one, because it isn't specific to AWS or GCE or any cloud provider or provider of machines. Like the logic is basically the same where, after 10 minutes or whatever you configure, that you decide that machine is not joining and you delete the machine, I guess. And expect that then the cloud provider or the machine controller would delete the actual infrastructure. That came actually the other day in SIG AWS, where we're talking about nodes that go not ready. After about 15 minutes, we probably want to delete them, and we don't have that currently in AWS. So that's a sort of similar thing where we see infrastructure that we just want to delete because it's not recovering, and in the case of a cloud, it's better just delete the infrastructure.
But yeah, I think ultimately this is all up to the engineer designing and prescribing a control loop, which I think we will prescribe as a community. I just don't know if we're there yet.
Okay.
The way Bosch handles this, in case it's of interest to anybody, is there are separate concepts for instance and VM, although VM could be container, it doesn't really matter. And so the VM is whatever the IaaS or the infrastructure provides. The instance is a logical concept. And then, an operator typically interacts with instances and creates instances under the hood that's backed by VMs. But then Bosch also exposes like delete VM, list orphaned VMs, that sort of thing. So it keeps track of these VMs, and can also in some cases associate two VMs to an instance. For example, if you want to hot swap a VM and have that represent the same instance. So separating those two concepts, like machine is right now playing both of those concepts, but the logical instance and the physical machine. Having two separate concepts may be helpful.
Agree. Another pattern that I've seen be pretty successful is when your controller goes through an iteration, all of the infrastructure it does know about, it updates a timestamp. And that way you can define TTLs that say, if we have a bit of infrastructure, where you store that timestamp doesn't matter. It could be in a database, it could be in a tag. There's pros and cons to each of those. But when you get to a piece of infrastructure that hasn't had an updated heartbeat timestamp, you can probably say, according to some policy, it's safe to delete as well.
So, yeah, that's correct. So I think machine controller can take care of this part, except in the cases where, so say for example, the deletion call for some moment cannot go through, but we still want to maintain a number of machines, right? So at that point, we might want to create one more new machine, get it attached to the existing cluster, and let someone else, some separate garbage collector, get rid of the older machine which we were not able to delete previously. So yeah, of course, this logic could be baked inside the controller itself, machine controller itself. That's fine.
Yeah. I think in a perfect world, it would be baked into a controller with a nice config map that we could easily tweak if needed.
Yeah.
Not to inception any controller ideas, but that just seems like a stable pattern to me.
Yeah.
One more thing. Kubelet right now it actually does the garbage collection of orphan pods. So And yeah, in some cases, for example, the machine might have been forcefully deleted when the controller is down, and you also need to garbage collect in that case as well. So the machine resource is deleted, but the node is up, and then you need to do some magic in that case. Either delete the machine if it's not, for example, bound to a node, or try to create a new machine object and then put it back together.
Okay. Does that help answer your question and give you some ideas about abandoned infrastructure?
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else from anyone? Going once? Twice? Okay. Have a good day, everybody.